Officer Ryan Steele had learned one thing during his years on the Ashland police force: you had to take control before the situation took control of you. It wasn't always like this. Ryan had started his career with the hope of making a difference, of being the kind of officer who protected the innocent and held the line between right and wrong. But Ashland had a way of grinding people down. The once thriving city was now a fractured shell of its former self. Factories sat abandoned, streets were lined with decaying buildings, and tension simmered between its divided communities. Ashland had changed Ryan. The job that used to feel like a duty now felt like a war. And in war, you couldn't trust anyone. Ryan had grown cynical, and his instincts, honed by years of patrols in the city's roughest neighborhoods, told him who to trust and who to treat as a threat. His gut rarely failed him, and tonight was no different. The radio crackled, interrupting the steady hum of his cruiser as it rolled down the cracked, dimly lit streets. Unit 4 to 5, we've got a report of a suspicious individual, possible loitering, corner of Vine and Maple, elderly black female, long coat. Ryan's eyes narrowed as he turned the wheel sharply, heading toward the location. He had heard this call too many times before. The description was always the same: a suspicious figure in a bad part of town. His mind raced through the familiar scenarios. It could be a petty thief, maybe a drug deal gone wrong. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was maintaining control. As he approached the intersection, the woman came into view. She stood alone on the corner, hunched slightly as if the weight of the plastic grocery bag in her hand was too much for her small frame. To any other officer, she might have seemed harmless, just another old woman waiting for something. But to Ryan, trained by years of distrust, she was a potential threat. He had seen it too many times before, people who looked innocent but were anything but. He parked the car and stepped out, the night air biting at his skin. His hand instinctively hovered near his holster. The quiet street felt too calm, too still, and Ryan had learned the hard way that silence usually meant trouble was brewing. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" His voice was sharp, commanding. This was not a question, it was an interrogation. The woman turned her head slowly to face him. Her dark eyes were steady, her face calm, as if she had been expecting him. "I'm just waiting for my ride, officer. Is there a problem?" Her voice was soft, almost too casual, and it grated on him. Ryan's grip tightened. Something about her demeanor didn't sit right. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't scared. Two reactions he had come to expect from people when confronted by police, especially in this part of town. Her calmness felt like defiance. "Let me see your ID." His words came out clipped, his patience thinning by the second. The woman sighed quietly, reaching into her coat with slow, deliberate movements. Ryan's eyes stayed locked on her hands, ready to react at any sign of danger. She pulled out a wallet and handed it to him without a word. His fingers closed around it, and he flipped it open, already expecting to see some excuse, some flimsy reason to justify his instincts. But what he saw stopped him cold. Inside the wallet was a badge. An FBI badge. Ryan blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up with what he was seeing. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't what he had prepared for. He had been so sure that she was trouble. And now, as the weight of her credentials sank in, he felt his control slipping. His heart pounded in his chest, a sudden rush of adrenaline making his palms sweat. The woman didn't move. She stood still, her gaze steady and unyielding, waiting for him to react. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked again, this time with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Ryan swallowed hard, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? He had acted on impulse, on the same gut feeling that had guided him for years, and now he was standing in front of an FBI agent. His entire career, everything he had built, was teetering on the edge of a knife. The street wasn't so quiet anymore. A few people had begun to gather, standing at a distance, watching. Someone was filming. Ryan's pulse quickened. His authority, his control over the situation, it was all unraveling. He had to act, had to salvage this somehow. "I'm going to need you to stay right here while I call this in," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the authority he was used to wielding wasn't there. It sounded hollow, even to him. The woman raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She didn't say anything as Ryan turned away, fumbling with his radio. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. He had overstepped. He had misjudged. And now, with the eyes of the street on him, with the cold realization that this wasn't just another routine stop, He felt the walls closing in. As the radio crackled with the sound of his request for backup, Ryan's gut instinct, so reliable, so certain, had betrayed him, and deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of his fall. The quiet tension in the air thickened as Officer Ryan Steele stood frozen, staring down at the FBI badge in his hand. His mind raced for a way out. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He should have just walked away. Instead, here he was, holding an FBI agent's credentials, and a small crowd was already forming around him. The old woman watched him closely, her calm demeanor never wavering. She knew exactly what had happened. Ryan could feel it. He had made a fatal misstep, and now the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. His pulse throbbed in his ears, each beat a reminder of the line he had just crossed. Ryan knew he should have backed down. He knew the smart thing would be to apologize, hand her credentials back, and move on, but his pride wouldn't let him. He had already shown too much doubt, too much hesitation. The people watching, the phones recording, he couldn't appear weak, not now. He handed her back the wallet, his jaw clenched. "I'm still going to need you to wait here while I check things out." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You've seen my ID, Officer Steele. I don't think there's anything to check." Her words cut deeper than he cared to admit. She had the upper hand now, and she knew it. The ball was in his court, but every move he made only pushed him further into a corner. He had been so certain that she was a threat, so quick to act on his instincts, and now he was stuck. Ryan turned, pretending to make a call on his radio. His fingers fumbled with the buttons as he tried to figure out his next move. The people on the street were starting to whisper, their eyes glued to him and the woman. Someone chuckled. Someone else murmured something that sounded suspiciously like "he's screwed." Ryan's grip tightened on the radio. His frustration boiled beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. He couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. But the longer he stood there, the more helpless he felt. His mind raced through his options, none of them good. A woman took a small step forward, and Ryan snapped back to attention. "Stay where you are," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. He could feel the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she sighed, almost as if she pitied him. "Officer Steele, there's no need for this. I'm not a threat to you. I'm just here waiting for my ride. Why don't you just let me go, and we can both move on with our evening?" Ryan's pride flared again, stronger this time. He couldn't just let her walk away now, not after everything that had happened. If he did, it would mean admitting he was wrong, and in front of all these people, that was something he couldn't bear. "I'll decide what's necessary here," he spat, stepping closer to her. His heart pounded as he tried to maintain control, but he was running out of room to maneuver. The woman simply stood her ground, her face expressionless. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, like she was daring him to make the next move. Without thinking, Ryan reached for her arm. It was a mistake, and the instant his hand touched her, he knew it. The crowd gasped, and the old woman's calmness evaporated. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice became deadly serious. "Remove your hand, Officer Steele." Ryan hesitated, his grip tightening as if to assert his dominance. But the woman didn't budge. The tension between them reached a breaking point. His hand felt heavy on her arm, the small act of contact igniting something far bigger. "I said, remove your hand," she repeated, her voice low and commanding. But Ryan couldn't. He was too far in, too committed to backing down now. His mind screamed at him to stop, to let go, to walk away before it got worse. But his pride, his frustration, and the eyes of the crowd all bore down on him. He couldn't let go. Not now. The next moment happened too quickly for him to process. The woman moved with the speed that belied her age, her arm twisting out of his grasp with precision. Ryan stumbled back, shocked. The crowd murmured in surprise, some laughing, others just staring. Before he could react, she took a step toward him, her expression cold and unwavering. "You've made a mistake, Officer Steele, a big one." Ryan felt his world start to crumble. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged bursts. This was it. He had lost control. The small crowd was now fully engaged, cameras out, recording every second of his humiliation. "Look, ma'am, you're going to need to come with me," Ryan blurted out, desperate to regain some semblance of control. The woman gave him a hard stare. "You're out of your depth. I suggest you let this go." But Ryan was past the point of no return. He couldn't let it go. Not now. Not with everyone watching. Not with his authority hanging by a thread. He pulled out his handcuffs, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped forward. "You're under arrest," he said, though even he didn't believe it. The woman didn't resist. She didn't have to. As he snapped the cuffs on her wrists, Ryan felt the final thread of his authority snap. The crowd was silent now, watching in a mix of horror and fascination. "You don't know who you're messing with, Steele," she said quietly, her eyes locking onto his. "But you will." Ryan swallowed hard, trying to ignore the cold pit growing in his stomach. He had just arrested an FBI agent, and deep down, he knew there was no way out of this. The moment Officer Ryan Steele clicked the handcuffs around the old woman's wrists, the air seemed to thicken. Silence over the scene, interrupted only by the low hum of nearby traffic and the murmur of voices from the growing crowd. Ryan felt a sickening weight in his gut. His mind screamed at him that he had made a colossal mistake, but he was too deep, and now there was no backing down. The old woman stood calmly, her wrists bound behind her back, her expression unreadable. She wasn't panicking like most people would. She didn't argue, didn't fight. Instead, she held herself with a quiet authority that only made Ryan feel more on edge. Her steady gaze burned into him, a silent reminder that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He tugged her gently by the arm to lead her toward the squad car. A couple of bystanders gasped. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, judging every move he made. More phones were out now, recording the scene. Ryan's throat felt dry, his heart pounding against his ribs as he pushed forward, trying to ignore the sinking feeling that each step was taking him closer to disaster. "Let's go," he muttered, half to himself, half to the woman, who still remained unnervingly calm. As they neared the squad car, a voice rang out from the crowd, sharp and clear. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Ryan's head snapped toward the voice. A young man, probably in his 20s, was stepping out of the crowd, phone in hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. "She didn't do anything, man. You can't just arrest her like that," the man continued, his voice growing louder, more emboldened. Ryan gritted his teeth, feeling the pressure mounting. This was the last thing he needed, a public confrontation. His grip tightened on the woman's arm as he shot the man a cold glare. "Stay out of this," Ryan barked. "She's under arrest. Back off." But the man didn't back off. In fact, the crowd around him began to stir, murmurs of discontent spreading like wildfire. Ryan could feel the mood shifting, and with it, his control over the situation slipping further away. "She didn't resist," another voice shouted. "What's she even being arrested for?" Ryan felt a pulse of panic. He had no answer that wouldn't make him sound like a fool. He had already dug himself into a hole, and now it felt like the entire street was watching him, waiting for him to collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. The old woman's voice broke through his frantic thoughts, calm and firm. "Officer Steele, you're making this worse for yourself. I've told you who I am, and if you continue down this path, there will be consequences." Her words sent a chill down his spine, but he wouldn't let it show. He had to stay in control. He had to see this through. "I said, get back in the car," Ryan hissed, dragging her toward the door of the squad car, his voice barely hiding his frustration. He opened the back door, guiding her inside, but her eyes never left him. It was as though she could see straight through him, past the badge and the uniform, and down to the fear gnawing at his core. "Last chance, Steele," she said quietly as she slid into the back seat. "Walk away now or you won't like what comes next." Ryan slammed the door shut, his hands trembling as he turned toward the crowd. More people had gathered now, and the whispers had turned into louder conversations. Some were openly filming, others stood with arms crossed, glaring at him. A few were muttering angrily, clearly disapproving of what had just happened. "Hey man, we all saw what happened," the young man who had spoken earlier shouted. "You've got no right to arrest her. Let her go." Ryan took a deep breath, fighting to keep his temper in check. He had to stay professional, had to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not in front of these people. "Listen, you don't know the full story here," Ryan shot back, his voice louder now, more authoritative. "I'm doing my job. If you don't want to be arrested for obstruction, I suggest you back off and let me do mine." The young man looked around at the crowd, and Ryan could see that the tension was rising. People were starting to move in closer, and the energy was shifting from mere curiosity to something more dangerous. He felt trapped. Every second that passed made it harder to justify what he'd done, but backing down now wasn't an option. Out of the corner of his eye, Ryan saw movement, someone stepping toward him. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to his taser. His heart was racing now, a mix of panic and anger fueling his actions. His mind screamed at him to de-escalate, but his body was acting on its own, driven by fear of losing control completely. "Stay back," Ryan barked, his hand hovering over his taser, ready to pull it if he needed to. The crowd froze. For a brief moment, the tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could snap at any second. Ryan's breath came in short, shallow bursts. His mind raced, desperate to find a way out of this without making things worse. Before he could act, the sound of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder as backup approached. Relief washed over him. Maybe this would be his way out. Maybe the other officers could help calm the crowd, could back him up before things spiraled further out of control. Within moments, 2 additional squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they took in the scene. Ryan recognized Sergeant Hall among them, his commanding officer, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this could still be fixed. Hall approached Ryan, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the squad car where the old woman sat, to the crowd, and then back to Ryan. "What the hell is going on here?" Steele Hall demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. Ryan swallowed hard, trying to find the words to explain what had happened, but everything felt jumbled. He stammered for a moment before finally managing, I had reason to believe she was a threat. She wasn't cooperating, and..." Hall raised a hand, cutting him off. "A threat? She's in her 60s, Steele. But look at this crowd. They're ready to riot." Ryan's stomach twisted as he glanced back at the crowd. The phones were still out, the people still watching, waiting to see how this would end. His career, his reputation, everything was hanging in the balance. "Sir, I thought," Ryan started, but Hall shook his head, his expression hardening. "You thought wrong," Hall snapped, his voice cold. "Get her out of the car and uncuff her. Now." Ryan's heart sank. His hands felt numb as he fumbled with the car door, opening it and motioning for the woman to step out. She stood slowly, her calm demeanor never wavering, even as Ryan unlocked the handcuffs. The crowd cheered as she rubbed her wrists, the relief in the air palpable. But for Ryan, the humiliation was crushing. His mind reeled as he watched the woman walk toward Hall, who offered her an apologetic nod. Ryan's world felt like it was crumbling beneath his feet. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," Hall said to the woman, his tone soothing. "We'll sort this out properly. I apologize for the inconvenience." The woman smiled slightly, but her eyes never left Ryan. "It's not over, Officer Steele. Not by a long shot." Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of her words settling in. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Officer Ryan Steele stood frozen as the crowd's cheers faded into a distant hum, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. His hands trembled as he watched the old woman walk away, her back straight and her steps measured. Sergeant Hall was still talking to her, likely smoothing things over as best he could, but Ryan knew it was too late. The damage had been done. The moment the handcuffs had snapped open, Ryan's career had taken a nosedive, and he knew it. His instincts, the very thing he had trusted for years, had led him down the wrong path. Now he was standing in the middle of a scene he couldn't control, surrounded by witnesses who had recorded every second of his failure. Sergeant Hall returned after a few minutes, his expression cold and unreadable. Ryan could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Hall was the kind of leader who demanded respect, who believed that every officer under his command reflected on him personally. Ryan's stomach churned with dread. "Steele, what the hell were you thinking?" Hall's voice was low, but every word felt like a hammer. "You arrested an FBI agent. Do you even understand the mess you've created?" Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His mind was blank, racing with thoughts he couldn't organize. He wanted to explain, wanted to say that he was just doing his job, that he had acted on a gut feeling, but it all sounded hollow, even in his own head. I thought," Ryan stammered, his voice cracking. "I thought," Hall cut him off sharply. "You thought? Steele, you're supposed to know before you make a move like that. You don't just cuff someone, especially not an agent, based on a gut feeling. You've put the department in a serious position here." Ryan's chest tightened as he felt the gravity of Hall's words settle over him. His mind flashed to the crowd, the cameras, the whispers. They had all seen it. And once the footage hit social media, and it would be a PR nightmare for the department. Worse, it would be the end of his career. Sir, I don't want to hear it, Hall snapped. His voice was icy, laced with disappointment. You're being put on administrative leave, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and your gun. The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. His badge, his gun, the very symbols of his authority, the things that had defined him for so long, were being stripped away. He stared at Hall, disbelief and panic washing over him in waves. Sir, please, Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. I can explain. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Hall didn't flinch. It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you did. This is out of my hands now. The higher-ups will deal with it. For now, you're done. Ryan's breath hitched as he unfastened his badge and gun, his hands shaking as he handed them over to Hall. The weight of his actions, the finality of the moment, was suffocating. He felt stripped bare, as if everything he had built, everything he had worked for, had crumbled in an instant. Hall looked at him one last time before turning away. Go home, Steele. Wait for the call. Ryan stood there for a moment, frozen, watching as Hall walked back toward the other officers. His mind was spinning, replaying the events of the past hour over and over. How had it come to this? How had he let it get so far? He glanced back at the crowd, which had started to disperse. People were still filming, still whispering, but the excitement had died down now that the situation seemed to be resolved. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full extent of what he had lost. His authority, his career, his respect. All of it was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He got into his cruiser, the silence inside the vehicle deafening. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tried to steady his breathing. He needed to think, needed to figure out a way to salvage this, but the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The drive home was a blur. His mind was too clouded with regret and fear to focus on anything else. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the weight of the day had fully settled over him. He sat in the car for a few minutes, staring blankly ahead, unable to bring himself to get out. Finally, he stepped out of the car and walked into his house. The quietness of his home felt suffocating. His uniform suddenly felt heavy, constricting, as if it no longer belonged to him. He collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, as the reality of what had happened washed over him. How did I let this happen? He thought. His mind replayed the scene again, the woman's calm face, the crowd's murmurs, Hall's cold voice. The knot in his stomach tightened. The sound of his phone vibrating on the coffee table pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something told him it was important. With a heavy sigh, he answered. Steele came a sharp voice on the other end of the line. This is Agent Lawson, FBI Internal Affairs. We need to talk. Ryan's heart stopped. Internal Affairs. This was worse than he thought. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Officer Steele, you're under investigation for the unlawful detainment and arrest of Special Agent Margaret Tanner. We're going to need you to come in for questioning tomorrow morning. Ryan's mouth went dry. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. Yes, sir, Ryan stammered, his voice shaking. We're looking at a serious violation here, Lawson continued, his tone cold and unyielding. There will be consequences, and you'd better be prepared for them. The line went dead before Ryan could respond. He stared at the phone, his mind blank. The walls of his life were closing in on him, faster than he could react. This is it, he thought. This is the end. He leaned back on the couch, the weight of the day crashing down on him all at once. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his instincts, but now those instincts had led him to ruin. His pride, his anger, his need for control, they had all betrayed him. The FBI wasn't going to let this go, and Ryan knew it. The investigation would dig deep, and when it was over, his career in law enforcement would be as dead as his reputation. His mind raced, trying to grasp at any way out, but the truth was glaringly obvious. There was no way out. He had crossed a line, and now he was going to pay the price. The next morning, Officer Ryan Steele woke up to a cold, unfamiliar dread sitting deep in his chest. His alarm had gone off hours ago, but he hadn't moved. The weight of the previous day hung over him like a storm cloud, pressing down with each passing minute. His career, his life was spiraling out of control, and the only thing waiting for him today was the inevitable reckoning. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him out of the haze. It was a news alert. Ryan reached for the phone with a shaking hand, his stomach turning as he saw the headline. Police officer under investigation after wrongful arrest of FBI agent goes viral. Ryan's heart sank. He clicked the link, and there it was, a video from last night. The entire incident, his confrontation with Special Agent Margaret Tanner, his arrest of her, the crowd's reaction captured from multiple angles. The footage was spreading like wildfire, shared across social media with captions calling for justice, accountability, and his resignation. Some clips even called for his arrest. The comments below the video were a flood of outrage. Another corrupt cop. This is why we need police reform. Look at how casually he violated her rights. He arrested an FBI agent. What kind of idiot does that? The words blurred as Ryan stared at the screen, his throat tight and dry. He felt exposed, like a criminal awaiting trial. His name was out there for the world to see, and the world was ready to tear him apart. A loud knock on the door snapped him out of his daze. His body stiffened. He knew who it was, FBI Internal Affairs, as promised. They had wasted no time. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before heading to the door. His heart pounded as he opened it, revealing two men in dark suits, their expressions hard and businesslike. The one in front, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward, flashing his badge. Officer Steele, Agent Lawson, FBI Internal Affairs. This is Agent Grant, the man said, gesturing to the other agent. We're here to escort you to headquarters for questioning. Ryan nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. He felt the walls closing in around him as the two agents stepped inside. Without another word, they motioned for him to follow them to the car. The ride to the FBI headquarters felt like an eternity, the silence in the vehicle heavy with tension. Ryan stared out the window, his mind racing through the events of the past day. Every detail, every mistake replayed in his head like a broken record. When they arrived at the sleek, imposing building, Ryan's stomach twisted even tighter. He had walked into precincts 1,000 times before, but this felt different. It wasn't his territory, it was theirs. As the agents led him through security and down a long corridor, the weight of the situation began to fully sink in. This wasn't just about his mistake anymore. It was about his entire future, and it felt like he was walking toward his execution. They led him into a sterile interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A simple table and two chairs sat in the center of the room. Ryan took a seat, his palms slick with sweat, as Agent Lawson and Agent Grant sat across from him. Lawson placed a folder on the table, his eyes cold and focused. We're going to make this simple, Officer Steele. You already know why you're here. Your arrest of Special Agent Tanner has raised serious concerns about your conduct, not just in this incident, but over your entire career. Ryan swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. Lawson opened the folder, sliding a photo of Margaret Tanner across the table. Special Agent Tanner has filed a formal complaint against you. She alleges not just wrongful arrest, but also misconduct and abuse of power. We're investigating the potential for civil rights violations in this case. Ryan's mind spun. Civil rights violations. That was the death blow. He had been expecting a reprimand, maybe a suspension, but civil rights charges. That was a career ender. Ryan started, but Lawson held up a hand. Before you speak, know that we have hours of footage from that night. Multiple witnesses, all of whom corroborate Agent Tanner's account of the incident. You were the aggressor, Steele. You overstepped your authority, and now you're going to face the consequences. The walls felt like they were closing in around Ryan. His chest tightened, and he struggled to catch his breath. He had known the situation was bad, but hearing it laid out so coldly, so officially, made it all feel so much worse. We'll give you a chance to explain yourself, Lawson continued, leaning forward. But understand this, your actions have already caused irreparable damage to the department, to the FBI, and to your career. The only question now is how far this goes. Ryan sat in stunned silence, his mind grasping for a way out, some explanation, some excuse that could salvage what was left of his life. But there was nothing. The truth was laid bare. And no matter how hard he tried to justify his actions, it all came back to the same thing. His pride, his anger, his need for control had destroyed him. Ryan's voice cracked. I thought she was a threat. She wasn't cooperating, and Lawson's eyes narrowed. And you thought that justified handcuffing an FBI agent, an elderly woman who posed no physical threat to you. That's your defense. Ryan's mouth went dry. It sounded ridiculous now that it was laid out in front of him. He had overreacted, let his emotions cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. I made a mistake, Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A mistake, Agent Grant finally spoke, his tone harsh. Officer Steele, this wasn't just a mistake. You violated a federal agent's rights in front of a crowd of witnesses, many of whom were filming the entire thing. That video is everywhere now, and it's not going away. You've put the entire department under scrutiny. Ryan's stomach churned. He had seen the video. He knew what was being said about him online, and there was no undoing the damage. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage his career, but every path led to the same conclusion: it was over. Lawson leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. Here's what's going to happen, Steele. We're going to complete our investigation. And when we do, you'll likely face charges. At the very least, this will go to civil court, and I doubt you'll come out of that unscathed. Ryan's chest tightened. Charges. Civil court. His career was circling the drain, and he could feel himself sinking further and further into the abyss. We'll give you a chance to cooperate, Lawson said, his voice sharp. If you come clean now, admit to your misconduct, we might be able to work something out, maybe avoid jail time. But if you try to fight this... Lawson's words hung in the air like a threat. Ryan knew what they meant. He could either go down quietly or go down fighting, but either way, he was going down. The door to the interrogation room suddenly swung open, and a man in a crisp suit stepped in. Ryan recognized him immediately, Detective Mason, one of the senior officers in his department. His presence in the room sent a wave of fear through Ryan. Mason had always been a no-nonsense, hard-hitting investigator. If he was here, things were even worse than Ryan had thought. Mason gave Ryan a cold look before addressing Lawson. I'll take it from here. Here. Lawson exchanged a glance with Agent Grant, then stood gathering his papers. You have until tomorrow to decide, Steele. Cooperate or this goes public. The agents left the room, leaving Ryan alone with Mason, who wasted no time getting to the point. Steele, Mason began, his tone steely. You put us all in a difficult position. This is no longer just about you. The entire department is under fire because of what you did. We've got media swarming the station, protesters outside, and now the FBI breathing down our necks. Ryan felt his throat tighten. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Mason cut him off, his voice cold and unforgiving, but it did. And now you need to clean up your mess. You've got one chance, Steele, one chance to make this right. Ryan blinked, his mind racing. What do you mean? Mason leaned in, his eyes sharp. You're going to publicly apologize. You're going to admit that you overstepped, that you violated her rights, and you're going to take the fall. The department will back you if you go quietly, but if you fight this, you're on your own. And trust me, Steele, you don't want to be on your own. The weight of Mason's words hit Ryan like a ton of bricks. Apologize? Publicly admit that he was wrong? It would be the end of everything. His career, his reputation gone. But the alternative was worse. He could see it now, a long, drawn-out legal battle, his name dragged through the mud, the media tearing him apart piece by piece. He had no choice. I'll do it, Ryan whispered, barely able to get the words out. Mason's expression didn't change. Good, we'll arrange the press conference for tomorrow. Until then, stay out of sight. As Mason left the room, Ryan felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. It was over. His career, his pride, his life as he knew it, everything was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The day of the press conference arrived, and Officer Ryan Steele had never felt more alone. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, trying to reconcile the man he saw with the image he once held of himself. Gone was the proud, confident officer who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. In his place stood a man weighed down by shame, fear, and the crushing reality that his career, His life was about to come crashing down. His uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, almost foreign. It had once been a source of pride, but now it felt like a symbol of everything he had lost. Ryan knew that after today, he wouldn't be wearing it again. His department had made that clear. The press conference wasn't just an apology, it was a resignation, a public admission of guilt that would mark the end of his career. The pressure from the media had been relentless. The video of his arrest of Special Agent Margaret Tanner had spread like wildfire, igniting a public outcry that showed no signs of fading. Protesters had gathered outside the precinct demanding accountability, while news outlets ran headlines condemning him as a symbol of everything wrong with the police force. The department had tried to contain the situation, but it was too late. The damage was done, and Ryan knew that he was the one who would bear the full brunt of the fallout. As he stood in the empty locker room, the weight of the last few days crashed down on him. He thought about all the years he had spent as an officer, the sacrifices he had made, the lives he had tried to protect. And yet, in a single moment, it had all unraveled. His instincts, the very thing he had trusted to guide him, had betrayed him. The door creaked open, and Sergeant Hall stepped inside, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. He had been the one to arrange this press conference, the one to push Ryan into making the public apology. Hall had made it clear that this was the only way to salvage what little dignity Ryan had left. "It's time," Hall said, his voice devoid of emotion. Ryan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He straightened his uniform one last time, though he knew it didn't matter. After today, he would no longer be Officer Steele. He would just be Ryan, a man disgraced, broken, and discarded. They walked through the precinct in silence, the halls eerily quiet. The other officers barely looked at him, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort. Ryan could feel their judgment, their silent relief that it was him, and not them standing on the chopping block. As they reached the door leading outside, Ryan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, the hum of the cameras, and the distant chants of the protesters. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how far he had fallen. The door swung open, and the bright flash of cameras hit him like a wave. Reporters swarmed the front of the building, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions over one another. The crowd of protesters stood beyond the barricades, their signs raised high, their voices loud and angry. Ryan's eyes scanned the crowd, his stomach churning as he caught sight of the signs. Justice for Tanner, end police abuse reform. Now each one felt like a personal attack, a reminder of the mistake that had brought him here. Sergeant Hall led him to the podium set up in front of the precinct, where a cluster of microphones awaited him. Ryan's hands shook as he approached, the weight of the moment nearly unbearable. This was at the moment when he would have to admit to the world that he had failed, that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He stood behind the podium, the sea of faces staring up at him, waiting for him to speak. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant clicks of cameras. Ryan's heart raced, his mind spinning as he tried to find the words, but nothing felt right. Nothing could undo what had happened. Sergeant Hall stepped up beside him, his voice firm as he addressed the crowd. "Good morning. Officer Steele is here today to address the incident involving Special Agent Margaret Tanner. This department takes these matters very seriously, and Officer Steele has prepared a statement. We ask that you listen carefully and with respect." Hall stepped back, leaving Ryan alone at the podium. The microphones loomed in front of him, and for a moment, he considered walking away, disappearing into the crowd, and never looking back. But there was no escape. This was his reality now. Ryan took a deep breath, his voice shaky as he began. "Good morning. My name is Officer Ryan Steele. I'm here today to address the events that took place last week involving the wrongful arrest of Special Agent Margaret Tanner." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, each one dragging him deeper into the pit of guilt and shame. He forced himself to continue, though his voice faltered with every sentence. I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I acted on instinct, and in doing so, I violated the rights of an innocent person. Special Agent Tanner did nothing wrong, and I should have recognized that. I should have handled the situation differently." The crowd was silent, but Ryan could feel the judgment in their eyes. He could see the reporters jotting down notes, recording every word for the evening news. The protesters stood still, their signs held high, waiting for him to finish. I take full responsibility for my actions, Ryan continued, his voice hollow. I understand the damage I've caused, not just to Special Agent Tanner, but to this department and to the trust that the public places in us as law enforcement officers. For that, I am deeply sorry. Ryan paused, his throat tight as he struggled to hold back the overwhelming wave of emotion that threatened to crash over him. He had spent his entire life serving this city, and now, in front of everyone, he was forced to admit that he had failed. I want to apologize to Special Agent Tanner, to the FBI, and to the community, Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. I know that my actions have caused harm, and I will do everything in my power to make amends. I know that this apology won't undo the damage I've caused, but I hope it's a step toward earning back the trust that I've lost. He could barely hear his own words now. His mind was numb, the weight of everything crushing him from all sides. The truth was, he didn't believe his own apology. He wasn't sure he ever would. As of today, Ryan said, his voice barely steady, I am resigning from the Ashland Police Department. The crowd erupted. The reporters shouted questions, the protesters cheered, and Ryan felt like he was drowning in the noise. His vision blurred as he stepped away from the podium, the weight of his resignation sinking in. This was the end of everything he had known. Sergeant Hall placed a firm hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the cameras, away from the crowd. But the noise followed him, echoing in his ears as they retreated inside the precinct. Ryan's legs felt heavy, each step more difficult than the last. By the time they reached the quiet of the precinct's hallway, he felt like he could barely stand. Hall didn't say anything, just led him back to the locker room in silence. When they reached the door, Hall finally spoke, his voice low and firm. You did what needed to be done, Steele. Ryan didn't respond. He didn't have the energy. His mind was numb, his body exhausted. He sat down on the bench, staring at the floor as Hall stood by the door, watching him. After a long moment, Hall spoke again. You'll get a severance package. The department's going to help you out, but you need to lay low for a while. Let things cool down. Ryan nodded, though the words barely registered. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. Hall lingered for a moment longer before finally turning and leaving Ryan alone in the locker room. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence was deafening. Ryan sat there, staring at the locker in front of him, his mind blank. He had resigned. His career was over. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was gone. And for what? A mistake. A single moment of misjudgment that had spiraled into something he could never undo. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, half expecting another news alert or message from the department. But it wasn't. It was a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You'll pay for what you did. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the message, the cold realization settling over him. The public apology hadn't been enough. The resignation hadn't been enough. There were still people out there who wanted more, who wanted him to suffer. He stared at the phone, the weight of the message pressing down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about his life. And in that moment, Ryan knew that no matter how far he tried to run, no matter how much he tried to atone for his mistakes, he would never truly escape what he had done. The air outside the precinct felt colder than it should have for mid-morning, as Officer Ryan Steele knew. Just Ryan now walked out of the building for the last time. The press conference was over, his resignation was public, and the storm he had been running from had finally caught him. His uniform, which he had worn for years with pride, now felt like a costume, one he was eager to shed but unsure of what would be left beneath it. The crowds had dispersed, the reporters had moved on to the next story, and the protesters were gone. But the weight of what had just transpired still hung heavy in the air, clinging to Ryan like a shadow. His resignation might have satisfied the public and his department for now, but deep down he knew it wasn't enough. He walked toward his car, the silence around him suffocating. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the last few days, every mistake, every misstep. The public humiliation of the press conference was supposed to be the end, the final act in his fall from grace. But it didn't feel like closure, it felt like a new beginning, one he wasn't ready for. As he slid into the driver's seat, he let out a long breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure where to go, what to do. He had no plan. All he knew was that his life as he had known it was over. The badge, the uniform, the authority, everything that had defined him for so long was gone. Ryan drove aimlessly through the city, his mind too clouded to focus on anything in particular. Ashland looked the same as it always had, but to him, it felt different now. The streets he had once patrolled with a sense of duty now felt foreign, as if he were an outsider looking in. Every corner, every block held memories of his time as an officer, but now those memories were tainted. He pulled into a quiet parking lot near the riverfront, one of the few places in the city that still held some peace. He parked the car and got out, walking toward the water's edge. The river flowed steadily, indifferent to the chaos of the city around it. Ryan sat on a bench staring out at the water, his thoughts swirling. What now? The question had been haunting him since the moment he handed over his badge. What was he supposed to do now? He had spent his entire adult life as a police officer. It was all he knew. But now, without the badge, without the uniform, he was just Ryan Steele, a man who had made a terrible mistake, a man whose life had unraveled because of it. The text message from earlier still gnawed at him. This isn't over. You'll pay for what you did. It was a threat, plain and simple. But from whom? He had tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just someone venting their anger, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. Someone out there wanted more than just his resignation, they wanted retribution. Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting another threatening message, but it wasn't. It was a call from his sister, Emily. He hadn't spoken to her in days, not since the story had broken. She had called several times, but he hadn't been able to face her, not with everything that had happened, not with the shame hanging over him like a cloud, but now he felt an overwhelming need to hear her voice, to feel some kind of connection to the world outside his own mind. He answered, his voice hoarse. Hey, Em. Ryan, her voice was soft, filled with concern. I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay? He let out a bitter laugh. No, not really. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with empathy. I saw the press conference. I'm so sorry, Ryan. I can't imagine what you're going through. Ryan closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It's a mess. Everything's just falling apart. I know, she said gently, but you don't have to go through this alone. You can come stay with me for a while. If you need to, get away from all of this. Her offer was tempting, more tempting than he wanted to admit, but he couldn't run away. Not yet. There were still too many loose ends, too many things left unresolved. The investigation, the media, the threats. He couldn't leave without facing those first. I appreciate it, he said quietly, but I need to stay here for a while. There's still some stuff I have to deal with. Emily didn't push, but he could hear the worry in her voice. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay? I don't shut everyone out. You don't have to go through this alone. I'll try, he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. They talked for a few more minutes, but Ryan could sense the unspoken worry in every word she said. When they hung up, he felt the same crushing loneliness settle back over him. Emily's offer had been kind, but there was nothing she could do to fix this. No one could. This was his mess, and he had to face it alone. Hours passed as Ryan sat by the river, lost in thought. He watched the sun sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. The text message still lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. Whoever had sent it wasn't done with him, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Finally, as the sky turned to dusk, Ryan made a decision. He couldn't keep hiding from this. He needed to confront the reality of his situation, to face the consequences head on. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could try to make things right. He didn't know how yet, but he had to try. His first step was to report the threatening message. He wasn't sure what it would accomplish, but it was the right thing to do. The message had crossed a line, and he couldn't ignore it. He drove to the local precinct, the one he had just resigned from, and walked inside. The familiar sights and sounds of the station hit him like a wave. It felt strange to be here without a badge, without the authority that had once been his. The officers barely acknowledged him as he approached the front desk. He was no longer one of them, and they made sure he felt it. I need to report a threat, Ryan said to the officer behind the desk, his voice steady but strained. The officer looked up, clearly recognizing him. There was a flicker of something pity, maybe in his eyes, before he nodded. "Okay, I'll get someone to take your statement." Ryan sat in the waiting area, his nerves on edge. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, a detective approached him, Detective Mason, the same man who had been present during his resignation. Mason's expression was hard, but not unkind. "Steele, heard you wanted to report something." Ryan nodded, his hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. "I got a text earlier. It said, 'This isn't over. You'll pay for what you did, I think. I think someone's targeting me.'" Mason raised an eyebrow. "Any idea who?" Ryan shook his head. "No, but after everything that's happened, it wouldn't surprise me if someone out there wanted to take things further." Mason nodded slowly, taking out a notepad. "All right, let's get the details. We'll look into it." Ryan gave him the information, but even as he did, he could see the skepticism in Mason's eyes. He wasn't sure if it was because Mason doubted the seriousness of the threat, or if it was because Ryan's credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed. Either way, Ryan felt a sinking feeling in his chest. Even in reporting this threat, he felt powerless. Once the report was filed, Mason gave him a curt nod. "We'll be in touch if we find anything. In the meantime, Steele, stay safe. Things are rough right now, but don't do anything stupid." Ryan nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He knew the threat was real. He could feel it in his gut, and it wasn't just about the text. It was the way the world seemed to be closing in on him, the way every shadow seemed a little darker, every glance a little more suspicious. He had crossed a line, and now there were people out there who wanted him to pay maybe more than he already had. As he left the precinct, Ryan felt a heavy sense of inevitability settle over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.